On the morning of June 4, 1942, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi realized the unthinkable. An American aircraft carrier was within striking distance. He fiercely demanded an immediate attack, urging his commander to launch every available plane with whatever weapons were already loaded. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo refused, choosing to wait for a perfectly organized strike. That hesitation was fatal. Minutes later, American dive bombers plunged from the clouds, reducing the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu to burning wrecks. For decades, history has claimed that this single rejected order cost Japan its fleet and fundamentally altered the Pacific War. The story we've been told for over 80 years paints a perfectly tragic, almost cinematic picture. We are taught to imagine the wooden flight decks of the Imperial Japanese Navy packed tight with strike planes, their engines already roaring, fueled, and fully armed. In this enduring version of history, victory, or at least survival, was literally moments away. It was thwarted only by a stubbornly cautious commander who valued rigid, by-the-book procedure over the desperate reality of combat. But if Vice Admiral Nagumo had listened to Yamaguchi's urgent plea, could those planes have actually launched in time to strike the Americans and save the carriers? Or is this dramatic image of a doomed, last-second strike force an illusion created long after the fires burned out? We are going to break down the agonizing timeline of that morning, tearing away the comfortable post-war myths to examine the brutal, mechanical realities of operating a World War II aircraft carrier. We are stripping away the legend of a single fatal mistake to conduct a tense forensic investigation into an impossible countdown. We will track two separate, unforgiving clocks ticking toward a catastrophic collision.
Because to determine if one man's instinct could have truly spared the Japanese fleet, we first have to step back and look at the immense, yet terrifyingly fragile trap that Japan had just set for itself. Japan didn't expect a fair fight. They expected an execution. Their entire strategy for the Midway operation was built upon a towering, brittle mountain of assumptions. They firmly believed that the American Navy, still reeling from the devastating blow at Pearl Harbor and the recent loss of the carrier Lexington at the Battle of the Coral Sea, was weak, demoralized, and utterly predictable.
The Imperial plan was not defensive. It was an elaborate trap designed to draw the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet out from its anchorage and destroy it in one final decisive blow that would secure Japanese dominance for decades. But this complex plan required perfect synchronization, flawless intelligence, and a total lack of initiative from the enemy. It was a strategy made of glass, elegant, precise, but doomed to shatter if hit by any unexpected reality. Nagumo and his staff were steaming toward Midway with absolute confidence, unaware that their enemy, having broken their operational codes, was not the prey but the hunter, waiting in a meticulously prepared ambush. At dawn on June 4, 1942, Vice Admiral Nagumo commanded the Kido Butai, the mightiest concentration of carrier air power on Earth. He had 4 magnificent fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. His immediate operational objective was twofold. First, he had to neutralize the American airbase on Midway Atoll to allow a Japanese invasion force to land. Second, and most importantly, he had to be ready to attack and sink any American warships that might show up to challenge him. Per doctrine, he divided his massive striking force to meet both contingencies. At approximately 4:30 a.m. in the pre-dawn darkness, he launched 108 aircraft, half of his total complement, to strike Midway. This left his remaining 100 dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters sitting in reserve, positioned on or just below the flight decks of his 4 carriers. This reserve force was Nagumo's anti-ship insurance policy. Per explicit, rigid standing orders, these aircraft were supposed to be kept fueled and armed with heavy Type 91 torpedoes and specialized armor-piercing anti-ship bombs, ready to launch a devastating attack against any American fleet that dared to appear. While the first strike wave was en route to Midway, the atmosphere on the Japanese carriers was one of routine, calculated professionalism. They were busy managing the combat air patrol fighters protecting the fleet and handling the normal operations of a carrier task force. At around 7 a.m., a frantic message arrived from the strike leader over the atoll. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga. There is need for a second strike. Midway was battered, but still active. The American air defenses had been tougher than expected, and the runways were still usable. This single message introduced the first critical, catastrophic variable into the Japanese timeline. Nagumo was now forced into a high-stakes dilemma. Should he strictly follow doctrine and keep his reserve force waiting for ships that his scouts had yet to find, or should he use that massive firepower to finish off Midway and protect the incoming invasion force? For 15 painful minutes, Nagumo deliberated. Based on every single piece of intelligence he had been given, there were no American carriers anywhere near the area. Keeping half his aircraft idle when Midway desperately needed to be neutralized seemed illogical. At 7:15 a.m., reasoning that a second attack was necessary to pave the way for the invasion, Nagumo made the tactical decision to ignore the standing anti-ship requirement. He ordered the reserve force, hundreds of planes currently armed to fight ships, to immediately rearm with high-explosive land attack bombs and prepare for a follow-up strike on Midway Atoll. This order unleashed a hellish logistical inferno down on the enclosed hangar decks of all 4 carriers. Rearming dozens of complex aircraft in a World War II carrier is not as simple as changing a magazine in a rifle. It is a brutal, exhausting engineering challenge conducted in spaces never designed for efficiency. The hangar decks were cramped, poorly ventilated, and quickly filled with the deafening roar of engines and the fumes of high-octane aviation fuel. The work was performed with sheer manual labor and brute force. The massive 1,800-pound Type 91 aerial torpedoes had to be painstakingly detached from each B-5N Kate bomber, lowered onto heavy, awkward transport dollies, and then manually wheeled along narrow tracks back to the bomb storage magazines. Simultaneously, teams of exhausted, sweating ordnance men had to retrieve massive 800-kilogram high-explosive land bombs from the same magazines, wheel them back out, position them precisely under the aircraft, and then use heavy hand-cranked winches to hoist and lock them into the bomb racks, often working around the planes whose torpedoes had not yet been removed. Mechanics worked shoulder to shoulder with ordnance crews, fueling crews, and pilots. Speed was essential, yet a single error, a single dropped spark, could vaporize the entire ship. This mechanical chaos required nearly an hour of non-stop, coordinated effort across dozens of teams and planes.
Down in this humid, dangerous labyrinth, the crews were fighting their own battle against time. Nagumo believed he had all the time in the world, that he was simply optimizing his forces for the day's operation. He was fundamentally wrong. The unseen ambush clock had already run out of time. Hours before Nagumo's rearming order was even given, dozens of American dive bombers and torpedo planes had already launched from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, and they were already on a direct, unalterable heading toward the Kido Butai. Right in the middle of this organized mechanical mayhem, a message crackled over the radio, utterly shattering the last illusion of Japanese strategic comfort. It came from the No. 4 reconnaissance plane from the cruiser Tone, a flight that had only just launched 30 minutes late due to a malfunctioning catapult. This late, seemingly insignificant mechanical failure was about to become one of the most significant delays in military history.
At 7:28 a.m., the pilot broke radio silence with a frantic report. Sight 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The reaction on the flag bridge of Akagi was instant and total shock. There were American ships nearby. This single scout report didn't just reveal the enemy fleet, it brutally exposed the staggering, fatal flaw in Nagumo's earlier assumption. He was not just conducting an invasion, he was in a surface engagement he had just disqualified himself from fighting. The news immediately threw the operations in the hangar decks into further catastrophic disarray. The glass plan had shattered. Down below, rearming to Midway bombs was instantly halted on dozens of aircraft that were already half-finished. Nagumo needed his torpedoes back. The chaos that had been growing in the hangars was about to get exponentially worse, but it was already too late to change the mechanical reality of the countdown. The Japanese fleet was trapped by its own decisions, completely unaware that an American strike force was already within sight, diving toward the heart of the unsuspecting Imperial Navy. The initial sighting of those 10 unidentified vessels wasn't enough to trigger an immediate launch. It merely paralyzed the command staff with agonizing uncertainty. For nearly an hour, Vice Admiral Nagumo frantically demanded to know the exact types of ships the scout had spotted. Were they just cruisers? Destroyers?
The answer did not come until 8:20 a.m., when the Tone scout plane broke through the radio static with a transmission that sent a shockwave through the flag bridge of the Akagi. Enemy is accompanied by what appears to be an aircraft carrier. In the unforgiving mathematics of naval aviation, those words meant only one thing. If an enemy flight deck was within range, the enemy aircraft were almost certainly already in the sky. A few miles away, on the bridge of the carrier Hiryu, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi intercepted the same chilling broadcast. Yamaguchi was a different breed of naval commander. Having studied and served in the United States, he was one of the few high-ranking Japanese officers who intimately understood the colossal industrial furnace of America. He knew with absolute certainty that Japan could never survive a long war of attrition. For Yamaguchi, survival dictated that speed, aggression, and ruthless initiative had to supersede flawless execution.
When he heard the word carrier, his operational intuition screamed that their timeline had just violently expired. He did not hesitate. He ordered his signalmen to aim their Aldis lamp directly at Nagumo's flagship. Across the water, the flashing light spelled out a desperate, unprecedented demand. Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately. Yamaguchi wanted every available bomber pushed up to the flight decks and thrown into the air right that second, armed with whatever mismatched bombs, torpedoes, or high-explosive shells happened to be hanging from their racks. It is easy, knowing the fiery destruction that followed, to judge Chuichi Nagumo for what happened next. But Nagumo was not a coward, nor was he paralyzed by mindless bureaucracy. He was a seasoned admiral looking at a tactical nightmare, and his hesitation was grounded in the strict, blood-written doctrines of the Imperial Japanese Navy. To execute Yamaguchi's frantic demand meant committing tactical heresy. If Nagumo ordered an immediate launch, he would be sending a fractured, uncoordinated wave of bombers into the sky with the wrong weapons, some carrying land attack fragmentation bombs that would harmlessly bounce off an American carrier's armored flight deck. Worse, he would be sending them without fighter protection. His Zero fighters were either currently engaged in furious low-level dogfights defending the fleet from scattered American torpedo attacks, or they were returning from Midway with empty ammunition drums and fuel gauges resting on zero. And then there was the inescapable reality of gravity. Just as Nagumo processed Yamaguchi's flashing signal, the sky above the Japanese fleet filled with the returning Midway strike force. Over 100 aircraft were circling the task force, their engines sputtering, their pilots wounded and exhausted. They needed the flight decks right now, or they would have to ditch into the sea. The ideological clash was absolute. Yamaguchi's desperate instinct that the ambush had already sprung, pitted against Nagumo's doctrinal need for a concentrated, perfectly escorted killing blow. Nagumo held the flashing message in his mind, but to execute it, he would have to defy the unforgiving physical laws of his own ships. To understand the absolute impossibility of Yamaguchi's demand, one must look past the romanticized image of airplanes simply taking off from a ship and examine the brutal, unforgiving industrial mechanics of an Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft carrier. The ships of the Kido Butai were not flat parking lots where aircraft could be started with the turn of a key and launched at will. They were floating, multi-level factories, and in 1942, the logistics of moving aircraft from the belly of the ship to the sky constituted one of the most complex mechanical bottlenecks in modern warfare. The vast majority of the Japanese strike force was not sitting on the wooden flight deck, basking in the Pacific morning sun, waiting for a signal. They were entombed below, sealed within the claustrophobic confines of enclosed double-decker hangars. These hangars were essentially massive steel tubes, poorly ventilated, reeking of high-octane aviation fuel, and packed so tightly with aircraft that mechanics had to weave sideways through the wings just to move. To launch a strike, the Japanese had to execute a staggering logistical ballet. First, every single aircraft had to be meticulously armed. We are not talking about clipping a magazine into a rifle. A Type 91 aerial torpedo weighed over 1,800 pounds. It had to be hoisted by chain pulleys, lowered onto heavily reinforced steel dollies, and pushed by teams of sweating armorers across a pitching, rolling steel deck. Once positioned perfectly beneath a Nakajima B-5N bomber, the crew had to manually crank heavy winches to lift the massive weapon into the plane's belly racks, securing it with precise locking mechanisms. If a ship leaned into a turn, those 1,800-pound torpedoes became deadly pendulums, capable of crushing a man to death or shearing the landing gear off an adjacent aircraft. Once armed, the planes had to be fueled. Aviation gas was pumped through thick rubber hoses dragged across the hangar deck, creating an environment so volatile that a single dropped wrench creating a spark could vaporize the entire vessel. Only when an aircraft was fully armed and fueled could the deck crews begin the agonizingly slow process of extraction. The Japanese carriers relied on a limited number of elevators to lift planes from the hangars to the flight deck. These were not modern, high-speed hydraulic lifts. They were heavy, deliberate machines. A crew had to manually push a bomber onto the elevator platform, secure its wheels, clear the perimeter, and signal the operator. The elevator would grind upward, lock into place flush with the flight deck, and another crew would rush forward to push the aircraft off. Then, the elevator had to descend all the way back down to repeat the cycle. Under ideal peacetime training conditions, operating at maximum efficiency, a highly trained Japanese deck crew could cycle one aircraft up to the flight deck every 2 to 3 minutes. For a massive strike package of 40 or 50 planes, merely bringing the aircraft up to the sunlight required over an hour of uninterrupted, perfectly choreographed labor. But bringing them up was only half the battle. Once on the flight deck, the aircraft had to be manually pushed aft, spotted into tight, interlocking formations to maximize deck space. Then, the engines had to be started. The radial engines of the era could not simply be throttled up immediately. They required a strict warm-up protocol. Oil temperatures had to rise to specific margins to prevent the engines from seizing mid-air. For 10 to 15 minutes, the flight deck would become a deafening, vibrating hellscape of spinning propellers, blasting slipstreams of hot exhaust backward across the deck crews. Finally, even if every plane was armed, fueled, elevated, spotted, and warmed up, they still could not launch. A fully loaded bomber, weighed down by an 1,800-pound torpedo and hundreds of gallons of fuel, cannot generate enough lift to take off from a stationary deck. The carrier itself had to become part of the aerodynamic equation. The massive 30,000-ton warships of the Kido Butai had to maneuver, sometimes radically altering the course of the entire fleet, to point their bows directly into the prevailing wind. They had to accelerate to nearly 30 knots, forcing a gale of artificial wind over the flight deck to give the heavy bombers the lift they desperately needed to claw their way into the sky. This was the inescapable physical reality that Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo faced when he read Yamaguchi's flashing signal demanding an immediate launch. The planes were not ready. They were trapped in the mechanical purgatory of the hangars, caught halfway through the catastrophic order to switch their weapons from land bombs back to torpedoes. In that agonizing moment, on the flag bridge of the Akagi, Nagumo was staring down the barrel of 3 brutal, unforgiving options. Option 1 was to obey Yamaguchi. He could order an immediate, desperate launch of whatever was currently sitting on the flight deck, and rapidly shove whatever could be quickly elevated from the hangars into the sky. But the cost of this action was horrifying to a meticulous fleet commander. The strike force would be a chaotic, uncoordinated mess. Some planes would carry torpedoes, while others would still be armed with high-explosive land fragmentation bombs, weapons that would shatter harmlessly against the armored decks of an American aircraft carrier. Worse, because the Zero fighters were currently tied up defending the fleet or returning from Midway, this makeshift strike force would launch without fighter escort. They would be sent into American airspace naked and vulnerable. But the most devastating cost of Yamaguchi's option was looking directly at Nagumo from the sky. Over 100 Japanese aircraft, the veterans of the morning raid on Midway, were currently circling the Kido Butai. Their fuel needles were resting on empty. Many were severely damaged, held together by canvas and sheer pilot willpower. If Nagumo turned the flight decks over to launch a fractured, desperate strike, he would be sealing the fate of those returning men. He would be forcing over 100 of Japan's most elite, irreplaceable naval aviators to ditch their priceless aircraft into the unforgiving Pacific Ocean to drown. Option 2 was the doctrinal path. It was the choice dictated by years of rigorous imperial naval training. Nagumo could clear his flight decks entirely. He could bring the returning Midway strike force aboard, save his veteran pilots, and strike their exhausted aircraft down into the hangars. Then, and only then, could he bring up his fresh, perfectly armed, perfectly escorted anti-ship strike force. It would be a massive, concentrated killing blow, exactly the kind of operation the Kido Butai was built to execute. It was the only rational, mathematically sound decision to guarantee maximum destruction of the enemy fleet. The only currency it cost was time. It meant temporarily surrendering the initiative and trusting that the Japanese fleet could survive whatever the Americans threw at them while they reorganized. Option 3 was the compromise of a desperate man, an attempt to do both simultaneously. He could try to land a few planes, launch a few fighters, shuffle bombs in the hangars, and keep the deck in a state of continuous improvised rotation. But every carrier captain knew that compromise on a flight deck invited utter chaos. A deck caught between launching and recovering was a paralyzed deck. Nagumo was an officer forged in the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Navy, an institution that worshipped the flawless, synchronized strike. He looked at the sky, at his fuel-starved veterans, and he made the only choice his doctrine and his logic would allow. He rejected Yamaguchi's demand. He ordered the flight decks cleared. The Midway veterans would be recovered first. The grand, decisive anti-ship strike would be meticulously prepared in the hangars and launched only when it was perfect. Nagumo believed his decision was rational. He believed he was managing a difficult logistical puzzle with cold, calculated efficiency. What he did not know, what his scouts could not tell him, and what his doctrine could not account for, was that the timeline for a rational decision had already evaporated. The Kido Butai was no longer operating on a Japanese schedule. Hundreds of miles away, the American carriers Enterprise and Hornet had already made their own gamble. Unlike the Japanese, who prized the perfectly coordinated massive aerial armada, the Americans had launched their strike in a state of desperate, fragmented urgency. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the American task force, knew he was outgunned. He knew his only advantage was the element of surprise. Rather than wasting precious time orbiting his carriers to assemble a massive, unified strike package, Spruance had ordered his squadrons to proceed toward the Japanese fleet the moment they formed up in small groups. The result was a disjointed, chaotic swarm of American aircraft spreading out across the vast emptiness of the Pacific. Dive bombers, torpedo squadrons, and fighter escorts became separated in the clouds. They were flying on outdated coordinates, navigating over an endless, featureless ocean, desperately hunting for an enemy fleet that was already moving away from their estimated position. Inside the cockpits of the American Dauntless dive bombers and Devastator torpedo planes, the psychological pressure was suffocating. The pilots were flying in strict radio silence, listening only to the drone of their own engines. The air at altitude was freezing, yet sweat pooled inside their leather flight helmets. Their eyes constantly darted between the empty horizon and the relentless, unforgiving downward creep of their fuel gauges. They were burning precious aviation gas, searching for a phantom fleet, knowing that every minute they flew outward was a minute they might not have for the return journey. They were a fractured, blind armada, operating on sheer adrenaline and raw, tactical guesswork. But despite the chaos, despite the lack of coordination, they possessed the one weapon that Nagumo had fatally surrendered, the initiative. By launching early, by launching fragmented, the Americans were closing the distance. They were converting time into proximity at over 200 miles per hour. Two unforgiving countdowns were now running simultaneously, separated by hundreds of miles of ocean, rushing toward a catastrophic intersection. Below, the Japanese were trying to solve a meticulous puzzle of hangar logistics. Above, the Americans were a desperate, uncoordinated shotgun blast aimed in the dark, hoping to hit something before they ran out of fuel and fell from the sky. And then, the interruptions began. Just as Nagumo's deck crews frantically began recovering the returning Midway veterans, the air raid sirens aboard the Japanese carriers began to shriek. The first American aircraft had found the Kido Butai. But it was not the massive, coordinated dive bomber strike the Japanese doctrine had trained to defend against. It was the torpedo squadrons. First came the lumbering Avengers and Marauders from the Midway Atoll itself, attacking in small, uncoordinated handfuls. Then, slowly, the carrier-based torpedo squadrons from the American task force began to arrive. Squadron after squadron of Douglas TBD Devastators, flying low off the deck, skimming just feet above the ocean swells, began making their agonizingly slow attack runs toward the massive Japanese carriers. For the American torpedo pilots, it was a suicide mission. They were flying obsolete, underpowered aircraft, flying in straight, predictable lines directly into a hornet's nest of anti-aircraft fire and the devastating cannons of the Japanese Zero fighters. They were slaughtered. One by one, the American torpedo planes were shredded by defensive fire, cartwheeling into the ocean in massive plumes of white water and black smoke. To the officers standing on the bridge of the Akagi, the American attacks seemed pitiful, almost amateurish. The enemy was throwing their aircraft away in piecemeal, unescorted attacks that failed to score a single torpedo hit on the Japanese fleet. The Japanese gunners cheered as the American planes plummeted into the sea. The Zero pilots racked up kill after kill, dominating the airspace with terrifying efficiency. Nagumo watched the slaughter and felt his confidence solidify. His defenses were holding. The Americans were bleeding themselves dry against his impenetrable shield.
But looking at the ocean and counting the burning American wrecks was the wrong way to measure the battle. The true damage of the American torpedo attacks was not being inflicted on the hulls of the Japanese ships. It was being inflicted on the clock. Every time a flight of American torpedo bombers approached, the entire Japanese fleet was forced to react. A 30,000-ton aircraft carrier cannot simply steam in a straight line while under torpedo attack. To present the smallest possible profile to the incoming weapons, the captains of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had to order violent evasive maneuvers.
The massive ships would heel hard over, their rudders screaming as they carved deep serpentine wakes into the Pacific, desperately turning their bows toward the incoming torpedo wakes to comb the tracks. When a carrier executes a radical, high-speed turn, the physical forces unleashed inside the ship are immense. The deck tilts at a terrifying angle. Inside the enclosed hangar decks, the centrifugal violence brought all logistical operations to an immediate, catastrophic halt. The exhausted armorers, who were desperately trying to swap land bombs back to torpedoes, had to drop their tools and throw their entire body weight against the heavy ordnance dollies just to prevent the 1,800-pound weapons from breaking loose and rolling across the deck. Aircraft chained to the floor groaned against their restraints. The elevators could not be safely operated. For the duration of every evasive maneuver, the entire rearming process was completely frozen, and the torpedo attacks kept coming. Not in one massive wave, but in a relentless, uncoordinated trickle. Just as the Japanese carriers would level out, just as the deck crews would resume their frantic labor in the hangars, another warning would sound. The ships would heel over again, and the process would instantly paralyze once more. Furthermore, the relentless, low-level American attacks placed an unbearable strain on the Japanese combat air patrol. The Zero fighters, flying at maximum throttle to intercept the torpedo planes, were rapidly burning through their fuel and their 20mm cannon ammunition. They could not stay in the air indefinitely. They needed to land. This created a fatal feedback loop on the flight deck. Nagumo needed to bring up his anti-ship strike force from the hangars, but his flight decks were constantly commandeered by the desperate need to launch fresh Zeros and recover exhausted ones. A carrier deck cannot launch heavy bombers while simultaneously trying to land and service nimble fighters. Every time a Zero trapped on the deck to refuel, the massive elevators were denied to the strike force waiting below. Every time the fleet turned out of the wind to evade a torpedo, the aerodynamic requirement for launching bombers vanished. The American torpedo squadrons were dying, being wiped out almost to the last man. But in their sacrifice, they were acting as a massive, bloody wrench thrown directly into the gears of the Japanese logistical machine. They were forcing Nagumo to expend his most precious, irreplaceable resource, time. Minute by agonizing minute, the Japanese strike force remained trapped in the hangars, unable to rearm, unable to elevate, unable to launch. The chaos that Yamaguchi had warned against was unfolding, not because of a Japanese decision to launch early, but because the enemy simply refused to give them the breathing room to launch perfectly. For nearly 2 hours, the Japanese fleet was caught in this relentless, stuttering cycle of violent evasion and frantic, halted hangar work. The noise was absolute. The roar of the ship's engines pushed to maximum revolutions, the deafening bark of the heavy anti-aircraft batteries, the crackle of the smaller 25mm guns, the scream of the diving Zeros, and the echoing metallic thuds of near misses ringing against the hull plating. Below decks, the temperature in the hangars soared, filled with the choking exhaust of running engines and the sweat of men working beyond the limits of human endurance. Then, shortly before 10:20 a.m., the chaos began to subside. The last of the American Devastator torpedo bombers, having dropped their weapons to no effect, turned away or fell burning into the sea. The Zero fighters, having utterly annihilated the low-level threat, circled triumphantly over a fleet that had survived seemingly untouched. The defensive screen had held. Not a single Japanese ship had taken a torpedo hit. On the flag bridge, the atmosphere shifted from frantic tension to profound relief. The Kido Butai had absorbed the enemy's desperate blows and emerged completely unscathed. More importantly, the logistical nightmare seemed to finally be resolving. The last of the returning Midway veterans had finally been recovered and struck below to the lower hangar decks, clearing the wooden flight decks above. The violent evasive maneuvers ceased. The fleet leveled out, the massive wakes straightening as the carriers steadied their course. The captains ordered their ships to turn, pointing their bows directly into the prevailing easterly wind. The wind rushed over the empty wooden decks, the perfect aerodynamic canvas waiting for its masterpiece. Down in the upper hangars, the armorers wiped the grease and sweat from their faces. The chaotic weapons swap was finally complete. The Nakajima B-5N bombers were securely armed with their heavy, ship-killing Type 91 torpedoes. The Aichi D-3A dive bombers were loaded with armor-piercing ordnance. The crews began pushing the heavy aircraft toward the elevators. The massive lifts groaned into action, finally breaking the bottleneck, carrying the fully armed, fueled, and deadly strike force up into the morning sunlight. On the flight deck, the deck officers began spotting the aircraft, packing them tightly aft. Mechanics cranked the starters, and the radial engines roared to life, coughing clouds of blue smoke before settling into a deep, vibrating hum. The Zero escorts were fueled, armed, and ready to lead the way. Vice Admiral Nagumo looked out over the deck of the Akagi. It had been an agonizing, terrifying morning, but his strict adherence to doctrine appeared to have been vindicated. He had protected his veterans. He had weathered the disorganized American ambush, and now he possessed the perfect, devastating counterpunch. The strike force was assembling. In less than 5 minutes, he would give the order to launch, and the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy would sweep the American carriers from the Pacific forever. The trap had been survived. Now it was time to close the jaws. Nagumo had won his battle against the mechanical constraints of his ships. But as he looked out at his perfectly arranged flight deck, he did not look up. He had survived the torpedoes, but he had run out of time. For decades, the tragedy of Midway has been defined by one singular, heartbreaking image. We have been conditioned to see the wooden flight decks of the Kido Butai packed tight with a massive, perfectly arrayed strike force, propellers spinning, pilots in cockpits, awaiting only Vice Admiral Nagumo's command to unleash hell on the American carriers. In this enduring version, victory or catastrophe was a matter of mere seconds, lost only through one commander's rigid adherence to doctrine.
This dramatization of events, however, is not a historical fact. It is a post-war construct. It was popularized largely through the memoirs of Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the strike leader who survived to write the definitive and, for decades, unchallenged account of the battle. Later forensic historical analysis, examining original Japanese operational logs, action reports, and photographic evidence utterly shattered this narrative. At the moment Rear Admiral Yamaguchi signaled his urgent demand to launch, and during the nearly 2 hours of relentless chaos that followed, almost all of those intended strike bombers were nowhere near the sunlight of the flight decks. They were trapped below, They were entombed within the enclosed, suffocating double hangar decks, paralyzed by the rearming inferno, the mechanical bottlenecks of the elevators, and the ship's violent evasive maneuvers that instantly froze all aircraft movement. The visual reality on the surface of the Kido Butai was not an offensive strike force. It was a scene of desperate defense, with the decks commandeered almost entirely by the urgent recovery and launch of Zero fighters for the combat air patrol, trying to buy the fleet time against the sacrificial runs of American torpedo squadrons. Yet the most devastating collision between legend and reality is found not in the logistics of the hangar decks, but in the brutal, inescapable math of proximity. By the time Rear Admiral Tone's Scout No. 4 even confirmed an American carrier existed, it was already too late for salvation. The decision was no longer in Nagumo's hands. While Yamaguchi was flashing his desperate signal, massive strike packages of American dive bombers from both the Enterprise and the Hornet were not just warming up, they had been airborne and proceeding toward the Japanese fleet for over an hour. Yamaguchi's logic of an immediate attack to preempt the enemy was an illusion of control. Doomsday was already in flight, closing the distance at over 200 miles per hour. Because Nagumo's perfectly rational doctrinal decision to prioritize safety had required time, and the enemy's disjointed, desperate attacks had denied him that single commodity, the enclosed Japanese hangars have now been transformed into colossal, multi-tiered steel powder kegs. The agonizing countdown ended at exactly 10:22 a.m. Down in the cavernous, sweltering hangars of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the frantic logistical ballet was on the verge of its final movement. The torpedoes were locked in place. The fuel lines were decoupled. The massive elevators groaned as they prepared to lift the decisive strike force into the sunlight. Up on the bridges, the Japanese commanders watched their impenetrable defensive screen of Zero fighters reforming. But those fighters were in the wrong place. Pushed to their limits by the relentless suicidal runs of the American torpedo squadrons, the Japanese combat air patrol had been drawn down right to the surface of the ocean. They were skimming the waves, hunting the last survivors of the devastators. No one was looking up.
And right above them, hidden in the scattered morning clouds at 15,000 feet, the fatal stroke of American luck arrived. 2 entire squadrons of dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise had been flying on nearly empty tanks, searching an empty ocean, until they stumbled upon the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer rushing to rejoin the fleet. That white trail led them directly to the Kido Butai. They arrived exactly at the moment the Japanese carriers were at their absolute most vulnerable, turning into the wind, their decks flat, their hangars completely saturated with volatile ordnance. There was no warning radar to sound the alarm. There was only the sudden, terrifying scream of American radial engines as dozens of dive bombers pushed over into near-vertical plunges. The dauntless pilots plummeted toward the pristine wooden flight decks, completely unopposed by fighters, aiming directly at the massive red rising suns painted on the carrier bows. The Japanese lookouts finally spotted them, screaming frantic warnings into the voice tubes, but there was no time for evasive maneuvers. The physical laws of momentum that had paralyzed the hangar decks for the last 2 hours now held the massive warships perfectly still for the kill. The American armor-piercing bombs smashed through the wooden flight decks as if they were made of paper, but the true catastrophe was not the initial blast. It was where the bombs detonated. They exploded deep inside those enclosed hangar decks. The very perfection of Nagumo's preparation became the exact mechanism of his destruction. The hangars were packed tight with fully fueled aircraft, highly pressurized aviation gas lines, and rows of unsecured high-explosive bombs and heavy torpedoes left scattered from the frantic, interrupted rearming cycles. The American explosives triggered a sympathetic chain reaction of unimaginable violence. In a matter of seconds, the logistical bottleneck violently unspooled. Torpedoes cooked off in the flames, tearing the ships open from the inside out. Aviation fuel flashed into fireballs that blew the massive steel elevator platforms hundreds of feet into the sky. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu did not just take combat damage. They were instantly transformed into uncontrollable, catastrophic infernos. The meticulous doctrine, the flawless preparation, and the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Navy evaporated in a storm of superheated steel. The commanders who survived the initial shockwaves were left standing on melting bridges, forced to reckon with the ashes of their invincible fleet. When the smoke cleared over the burning Japanese carriers, the myth of a single fatal decision took root. It was easier to blame the catastrophe on Nagumo's caution than to accept the terrifying mechanical reality of what had actually happened. But history owes a different understanding to Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi. His frantic signal to launch immediately was not a magic key to victory. Instead, it was the desperate reflex of a commander who was the first to realize they were already dead. Yamaguchi was absolutely right to sense the closing jaws of the American ambush. He understood that once the element of surprise was lost, their meticulous doctrine was utterly useless. He demanded the best of the terrible options remaining, recognizing that speed was their only armor against a disaster already in motion. But having the clarity to see impending doom is not the same as having the power to stop it. Here lies the true tragedy of his rejected order. Yamaguchi was intellectually miles ahead of the battle, but physically chained to the unforgiving industrial mechanics of the hangar decks beneath him. Human instinct could pivot in a second. An 1,800-pound torpedo on a steel dolly could not. Even if Nagumo had instantly obeyed that flashing signal lamp, it would not have saved the Akagi, Kaga, or Soryu. An immediate chaotic launch might have managed to put a fractured, unescorted strike package into the air before the American dive bombers arrived. It might have inflicted heavier losses, changing the scale of the defeat, but it was not a magic spell to win the battle. It could not turn back the clock on the American squadrons that were already in the sky. The Japanese Empire was not doomed by one cautious admiral. It was doomed by an incredibly fragile battle plan that demanded flawless execution and collapsed the exact moment it met the chaotic, friction-filled reality of naval warfare. When we return to the image of Tamon Yamaguchi staring out at the Pacific horizon on the morning of June 4th, we no longer see a man who held the key to victory. We see a commander who simply realized, before anyone else, that Japan had completely run out of time.
He possessed the most agonizing burden a battlefield commander can carry, the absolute clarity to watch a fatal trap closing, combined with the physical inability to break his ships out of it. Admiral Yamaguchi recognized the American ambush and demanded the only violent, desperate action that might have disrupted the timeline. But in a conflict governed not just by human instinct, but by the merciless, unforgiving physics of time, steel, and machinery, tactical foresight offers no salvation. The enduring tragedy of that morning was never about a single rejected order. It was the brutal demonstration that in modern industrial warfare, seeing the trap is not the same as escaping it.